ready to step in if things get out of hand.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Maxie C. Jackson III, station manager for 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream. It's my pleasure to introduce today's forum, a panel discussion exploring gender equity in the workplace. Women make up nearly half of the U.S. labor force and are increasingly working in fields and industries traditionally dominated by men. A little bit of history. The passage of the Equal Pay Act in 1963 required companies and organizations to pay men and women equally, equal pay for equal work. However, a gender pay gap persisted. In 1996, April 12th was deemed Equal Pay Day to raise awareness of the continued gap between male and female wages. Influential women have also started speaking out. 5 women on the World Cup champion U.S. soccer team filed a federal wage discrimination complaint indicating that they are paid up to 40% less than the national male team. Actress Jennifer Lawrence penned an open letter after learning she and co-star Amy Adams earned less than male actors in the film American Hustle. And a move that would make Claire Underwood proud, actress Robin Wright demanded she be paid the same as actor Kevin Spacey for her work in the Netflix political drama House of Cards. So, how much less do women earn? The common statistic you've all probably heard is that women make 79 cents for every dollar a man makes. This figure is up for some debate. Some argue the pay gap is smaller. Others argue that the pay gap is larger, especially for women of color. Whatever the numbers are, a pay gap does exist between men and women. It begs the question, why do we in 2016 have a pay gap? Does the pay gap exist because of overt discrimination against women? Does it exist because, as many business leaders assert, women don't properly negotiate their own salaries? Or does it exist because of the choices women make, like the choice to stay home and be a caregiver to a child or a loved one, or the choice to accept a job with a flexible schedule or limited hours? It must be noted that these are often choices men don't have to make. It's a complex issue and one that likely doesn't have an easy solution. But we've assembled a panel of local leaders to help us discuss the pay gap and what we can do to ensure equal pay for equal work. Here with us today are Dr. Diane Bergeron, an associate professor of organizational behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Priyanka Chaudhry, partner at EY and leader of their diversity and inclusion efforts, and Kathleen Clyde, state representative of Ohio's 75th District and co-sponsor of Ohio House Bill 330, the Ohio Equal Pay Act. Let's get started. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quite an introduction. It sets up a lot of things for us to navigate. I want to start by going really big picture here and asking you, is the very fact that we live in a patriarchal society a factor? And anyone can answer that.
All right, I think we can all say yes to that unequivocally. You know, I think, and especially in management, which is my area, is we have this idea of think manager, think male, and so we have this conception of leadership at many levels as being masculine, you know, and so I think that has reverberations throughout.
I think that's a great point. So we have this initiative around illuminating the path to leadership for women. The very fact that we have to have this initiative and illuminate the path to leadership and highlight opportunities for them to network and know what their definitive path to progression is lends credence to that. Mm.
And I would say the discrimination that we see in so many areas of our public life it really has a lot of consequences in the pay and career area. And this equal pay problem is, I think, due to that discrimination and part of the patriarchy that we all need to stand up against and fight for equality.
One of the things we did in the introduction is kind of illuminate the historical path that we've taken in addressing equal pay for equal work. Let's talk about whether there are cultural, institutional, or even structural issues that impact this as well. We also often hear that argument with respect to racism, another issue that sort of lingers in our society. Here's another issue that lingers, pay equity with respect to women. Is it an institutional, structural issue?
I would argue that yes. You know, there's a broad variety of research showing that there is bias at almost every level, including from when someone is selected for a job to how performance is assessed, and then how people are rewarded, who gets promoted. You know, literally there are studies where you give the same exact resume to a group of people. The only difference is the name is either Jane or John. So gender is the only thing changing, and the men are given higher starting salaries, more likely to get hired, you know, and so the only explanation for that in an experimental study is bias.
And Diane, what you've highlighted, right, is the importance for paying attention to conscious and unconscious bias, right, setting the tone at the top in an organization where it's coming from your chief executive officer and really trickling all the way down into the performance management process, and how all of that is evaluated just lends to that.
And I would say too that with the gap can be greater depending on the career field that we're talking about, and really when you hold for the levels of education, job type, the point in time of the person's career, the gap persists no matter what we're looking at. And I think when you talk about racism as well, I mean, the pay gap is even greater when you talk about women of color, and that is institutional racism along with sexism that we have to battle when we approach this problem.
We'll unpack that a little bit later in this conversation. I want to reference a statement made by Claudia Golden, the Harvard University economist. She suggests that the converging roles of men and women are among the grandest advancements of the 20th century. Arguing, in summary, it maximizes the potential of men and women. They are more alike in how they are perceived and how they see themselves. She, in some respects, makes the argument that we're making a lot out of maybe nothing, or something less so. But when you unpack some of the details, as we talked about backstage, this is an issue in terms of over time, no?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And one of the things that, I think when people hear her talk, I think what a lot of people heard is there is not a gender gap, or we can explain all of it, and that's not true. If the raw wage gap is 22%, with women earning 78 cents on the dollar for every man, some of that was historically differences in education, and this is to her point, is that men and women are converging. It's no longer the case. Women and men pretty much have equity as far as educational and experience. But when you unpack that, what we can still not explain is about 7% of that pay gap. So we can explain a lot of it by choices that women make in terms of picking academic majors that are less lucrative. In terms of the industry they go in, men tend to be concentrated into higher wage industries, where women are concentrated into lower wage industries. But my point is, I care about that 5 or 7%, because, and I even did some statistics, so if you have an average income of $100,000 a year with, let's assume, a low annual salary increase of 3% yearly, that adds up to almost $600,000 over the cost of someone's career. So I don't want anyone saying to me, that's not enough to worry about, because for me, it would be, and I think a lot of people would agree with that.
And tell a working family, a working mom in Ohio that, it's not important that you make 78 cents on the dollar of what your male coworker makes. Tell her that as she's trying to buy groceries, or pay the mortgage each month, or make sure kids have what they need in their backpacks and clothes, and getting the books and school supplies. I mean, this has a real impact on Ohio's working families. And for an academic in the ivory tower to say that it's not important for people, it's important to the women that I represent in Ohio, for sure.
Kathleen, I want you to go a little further for us. You've uncovered some statistics around how we as a state perform, the state of Ohio, across the country. How do we compare?
We're actually a little bit behind in this measure. The national wage gap is women are on average earning 78 cents on the dollar of what men earn. In Ohio, it's 77 cents. So we're kind of behind where we need to be. I've also done a little bit of looking at what we do on the state level, for example. So, under Governor Kasich's administration, I believe his wage gap, there's a $5.04 an hour wage gap in the Kasich administration for his policy and different staff in his department. So we're certainly not leading from the state level. And before him at Governor Strickland, it was $1.28. So those are some Ohio statistics. We have a lot of work to do, and I think that my legislation would be a really important step.
We're going to ask you to unpack some of the legislative aspects that you've introduced. Before we do that, though, I want to ask Priyanka to talk about something that we kind of tipped our hat to, and that is this notion of the workplace and maternity leave. Would giving men more maternity leave balance this out a bit? How does that play into the equation?
That's a great point. So we have a study that we'll get into a little bit later, but one of the things that was a factor for gender parity, countries that have 11 more days for paternity leave. And so that's a bigger factor in giving women the opportunity to advance in their careers than maternity leave. And I was really excited. We did this study and we took this to heart earlier this year. We actually increased our parental benefits across the board for men and for women to 16 weeks. So an equal parental leave policy that they can take within 6 to 12 months of having their child, regardless of the path to parenthood. So also recognizing that family dynamics are changing, the needs of our people are changing, whether you have a child by natural birth or you're adopting a child or a foster child, you're entitled to the 16 weeks parental leave policy for men and women.
So your organization made that decision very consciously. I'm sure you looked across the system and looked at what other organizations were doing. Is it tough to make the sell institutionally, organizationally, to offer that to men? Or is there other factors, other statistics that give you leverage?
Yes, so we are an organization that's driven by data. Okay. We're accountants, and so the data speaks for itself.
Sure.
So I can maybe allude a little bit to the Peterson study here.
Please do.
We did a study with the Peterson Institute of Economics for 22,000 companies across the world, so over 91 countries. Really the largest study of its kind, because there have been obviously a lot of studies, but they're more focused either to specific industries or specific countries. And we felt that the breadth of the companies that were represented really lent credence to this. And one of the factors that came out of the study was the fact that paternity leave policies had a higher impact than maternity leave policies to driving opportunities for women. The other thing that came out of the study, that the gender gap is alive and well. That there are, if you look at these companies, 60% of them did not have a female corporate board member. 50% of them didn't have women in management. The other thing that came out of this study, which, again, as accountants just really spoke to us, is there's a clear correlation. So the companies that had 30% more women in senior management positions had 60% higher margin. Or 6%, higher margin, 60% is phenomenal. So with 6% higher margin. So that is a very powerful correlation. But it's not about just getting one lone woman to the top, right? Think of it as an ecosystem where women in corporate roles, whether it's a board member or executive management, are interacting and helping each other advance through the organization.
Diane, as someone who studies this whole area, if you will, break down for us a little bit about this notion that men prefer pay increases, whereas women prefer flexibility. That's something I know you've heard. What does that mean, and is that accurate?
Well, and I don't know if it's prefer flexibility or need flexibility.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I think in most, thank you. And I think, Maxie, this gets back to your point about a patriarchal society.
Yeah.
I mean, in most families, it's still the women that have, even if it's a dual income couple, it's still generally the female that has primary responsibility for child
Sure.
and, running the home. And so that requires time, that requires flexibility.
Is such a thing as the mommy tax? That's what
Yes.
you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Kathleen, let's go back to some of the legislation that you've introduced. Give us, sort of unpack, I know there are 3 major tenets to that, perhaps more, but give us, fill the skeleton up a little bit here for us.
Sure. I've introduced, along with my colleague from Cleveland, Representative Stephanie House, Ohio's Equal Pay Bill. The bill does has 3 basic things that it would accomplish. First, it would prohibit retaliating against employees for talking about their salaries. One of the problems that we have with our pay gap is that people in America and in Ohio don't talk about what they earn and can even be punished for sharing that information. So this would prohibit retaliation and try to bring this information out into the sunlight and start the conversation. Second, it would require businesses or vendors that do business with the state of Ohio to submit an equal pay certificate saying that they have done a review of their salary schedules and that they don't have a pay gap in their particular company, that they seek opportunities for advancement for women and men equally, and that they strive for equal pay in their business. And then third, and this is kind of a new element to Ohio's Equal Pay Bill, we are asking the state of Ohio and our local government entities to do a review of their pay scales and make sure that they are paying women and men in the same fields, and even doing an analysis of the different fields, maybe where there tend to be more women, and looking at the experience and background required for those positions and making sure that we're not undervaluing those areas and paying those women less because that's tended to think of as women's work or where women's jobs are. In Minnesota, they enacted that provision, and the women in public employment in Minnesota on average saw a pay increase of 9%. I think it was about $2,200 annually. So it would make a big difference. It's worked in other places, and I think it's time for us to have equal pay in the state of Ohio.
What do you think about that? All right. Another thing that's brought up, and I want Diane to address this, is this notion that in, I guess, the STEM professions, this gap is actually much larger than in other fields.
Yeah, and I think some of that is, again, the choices that women make of what fields to go in, but even in the STEM fields, but also even at the CEO level. We're talking about the raw wage gap of 22%. At the CEO level, I think it's more like 31 or 32%. And so, this is significant. The other problem with the STEM fields is even when women do decide to go into those fields, I think by mid-career, I can't remember the exact statistic. I thought it was something around 50% of them decide to leave compared to only a quarter of men that decide to leave. And what they cite is a very hostile or machismo work climate, that impacts everything, and it's not comfortable to be in, and that's even beyond kind of the bias that goes along with that discomfort.
Priyanka, address this issue of the environment. What are some of the things that organizations are doing to address that?
I would start with the tone at the top. I think that is just so important to really, for that to come, the message to come from the CEO, and for him to really advance women. The
Or
other
her.
thing,
Yes.
Or her.
all right, there you go. I guess I'm referring to our CEO, who happens to be
sure.
male and is a great advocate of that, but that's
Sure.
a great point. So it's the tone at the top, but also just throughout the organization, the focus on removing conscious and unconscious bias. Sponsorship is another great accelerator, right? It helps accelerate not only that individual's career immediately, but also really changes the culture of the organization over time. So those are some of the top 3 things that I would say, just starting and then cascading that throughout the organization, and the training around conscious and unconscious bias, but just making that a living and breathing part of the organization.
Yeah.
And can I build
Please,
on that, Maxie?
please.
Because I will say that the research on having a mentor or a career sponsor is impressive. People that have mentors have faster career advancement, more promotions, higher salaries, and having a sponsor is even more important than having a mentor. So a mentor gives you advice, a sponsor is the one looking out for you and saying, here's where you should go next in the organization, then actively working to help you get there.
Are there professional women's organizations that are advocating for that very thing?
I think they are, and I think one of the problems with organizations is, they try to set up a mentoring program, but informal mentoring is more successful than a formal mentoring program, because some people that sign up to be mentors should not be mentors, unfortunately. And so the people that tend to be the best are the ones that tend to be the mentors. And the other thing is, I think a lot of the advice to women in business has been go find a mentor, but it's not that simple. You get a mentor by being very good at what you do. Then you're giving back to the organization. People take an interest in you, and they want to advance your career from that perspective.
I want to peel back a little bit. Earlier on, we talked about the fact that women are often blamed for making poor choices. So let's start from the very beginning. You come out of college. What choices are being made there that start this sort of cycle of a downward or an increase in pay gap?
Yeah, this was concerning to me. There was a study released by the AAUW, which is the American Association of University Women, looking at the wage gap 1 year out of college. And it mirrored this general raw wage gap of about 22%. What they found is that all but, and again, similar to our general wage gap, all but 7% could be explained by choices men and women had made about what careers to go into. And so one example is, and so this is interesting. So the highest earning major at one university was petroleum engineering, median earnings of $120,000 a year. And a lot of men go into that. Compare that with the lowest earning major, which was counseling psychology, with average earnings of $29,000. Well, you can't compete if you are making those different choices. And what I will say is this shows where some of it is less than bias, because men who majored in a social science field only earned 70% of what men who majored in engineering made. So a lot of it really is the choices you make. And unfortunately, it's such an economic perspective on the issue. I would prefer that people go into the professions that they most want to and feel that they can make the most difference. And for women, I think a lot of those tend to be the helping professions, which unfortunately are undervalued in our society.
Including teaching.
Exactly, absolutely.
I would add to that a little bit, like mid-career is where we find that a lot of things just come together, right? You have a lot of family responsibilities. That's where workload increases, and you're sort of really on the path to your career trajectory is really taking off, and that's where we find a lot of women decide to either step back or really even step out of the workforce. And that's where flexibility and inclusiveness, but just that work-life integration concept and having the flexibility at work makes a big difference.
And what Priyanka is saying, this is where some of the statistics really get large. So for a study of MBAs, after about a decade, men are earning 60% more than women. With attorneys, after 15 years, male attorneys are earning 55% more than female attorneys. I know, it's stunning. And a lot of this is because the flexible work arrangements, but there's a penalty.
No doubt, the mommy tax again. Yeah. I want to get back to, Kathleen, some of the legislative element here. when you hear all these statistics and how does what you're putting forth going to play into all this?
Well,
What are the results?
what's frustrating about the Ohio Equal Pay Bill is the majority in the legislature is yet to schedule its first hearing. So, these issues aren't being debated or discussed or really taken seriously in our state house in Columbus. And I think that needs to change. And one thing we can do is reach out to our legislators and say, hey, this is a really important issue to us, that we earn as much as our male counterparts. One kind of bit of good news is we are seeing positive work where the state house and our state leaders really aren't showing leadership on this important issue. We're seeing leadership at the local levels. We're seeing Mayor Nan Whaley in Dayton address paid leave, and paid leave policies are closely related to equal pay and whether women are able to stay in the workforce. We have officials in Cincinnati discussing that. We have raise the minimum wage provisions being discussed in our cities, like here in Cleveland. Raising the minimum wage would help bring many women out of poverty and help add to closing the wage gap. So where the state is not leading, we are seeing some great leadership in our cities and from our mayors and city councils.
Yeah. Before I ask you all to provide some recommendations that folks in the audience here and listening can do to sort of rally behind this cause, we mentioned briefly that women of color suffer even more with respect to this. Any quick notes you want to add to that?
I can give some statistics on that. So for African American women, they earn 64 cents to every dollar that a white male earns. They earn 90% of what a black male earns. And then with Latinas, it's 56 cents to the dollar for white males, and then almost 90% for compared to Latin males. So it is really the white male is kind of the standard that everything is compared to.
Let me say too, when we have the Equal Pay Day where we try to shine the light on this issue, that's actually the day that it takes women on average to catch up to men for their earnings from the year prior.
Right.
So it's in April, as you mentioned.
Yep.
The Equal Pay Day for Latino women, I felt like we were in August or September, and it was. Yeah. It's tragic, and it's ridiculous that this discrimination persists in this way. And I think we really need to take stock that we're having that conversation so late in the year and have such a serious problem to address.
Priyanka, I'm gonna start with you and let you tell us your single most important recommendation to resolve gender equity in the workplace. What is that for you?
Let's start a conversation today, whether it's with a client or a peer or somebody who works with you, to really find a way to support a woman and help her advance in her career, and really start building that environment both through where you work but also with other organizations that you're affiliated with.
Diane?
So can I go at this at the individual level?
Please.
Because I feel like you can give advice to organizations, you can give advice to society, you can give advice to individual women. I would say, one, read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, because she cites all of the relevant research and has excellent advice. I think there's a few things. I think women do need to ask more, for negotiation. That's there was a study of MBA students coming out of the program, and there was a pay differential of about $7,000, and it was due to the fact that women didn't negotiate as much, recognizing, unfortunately, this is a catch-22, because when women do negotiate, we're also penalized for that. So, but I still think there's benefit in asking. I ask for things all the time, and I think this is related to most organizations have a set of formal rules, and I think women tend to follow the formal rules. There's also a set of informal rules. And so sometimes you have to ask multiple people to find out what is really possible here. and asking in multiple ways. So I think we can sometimes get more than we think we can. And my final piece of advice is look at the top of your organization, and this is related to Priyanka's point. If there is no one there that looks like you, is it really a place that you want to be?
Kathleen?
I'm going to focus on the political and say, we have leaders and political candidates and people in office. I have a colleague here in the room, Representative Greta Johnson, who's a strong advocate for equal pay and for these other policies that help us combat the pay gap. We need to call for hearings on House Bill 330 in the legislature. We need to support candidates and elected leaders who care about closing the pay gap and who care about addressing these issues that keep women in the workplace back, whether it be your local city council person, a mayor, and certainly your state leaders and who is running for your statewide and national offices, because we really need an all hands on deck, all levels of leadership approach. And you need to hold these candidates and these leaders accountable. So I encourage you to do that.
Thanks for the recommendations, ladies. Today we are enjoying a Friday Forum panel discussing gender equity in the workplace, featuring Dr. Diane Bergeron, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University, Priyanka Chaudhry, partner at EY, and Kathleen Clyde, State Representative of Ohio's 75th District. We're about to head into the Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our radio broadcast webcast or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow Branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. It's at the City Club. And our staff will try to work it into the program. Please make sure your questions are brief and to the point. Holding the microphones today are Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky and Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg. May we have the first question, please?
Good afternoon. I want to say thank you for this very important topic. This question is for Representative Clyde. I taught school for 40 years in the Cleveland District, and so often in poverty districts where students don't have supplies, they don't have books in the home, not because the parent chooses not to have that, but because the money has to go to other things like food. I haven't heard too much conversation about the impact that especially for African American women, the 56 cents, the impact that has on a child not being able to have the kinds of resources that he or she needs to be successful in school. So Representative Clyde, have you been using that as a reason? And if not, could you add that to the agenda of why we need this?
Absolutely, it's a great point. It highlights for me when I'm doing battle on the State House floor on these issues, and I hear things like women choose to be paid less, or they choose, exactly. I mean, I laugh as well, but I think, women, mothers want to provide for their families, and this isn't just an issue that we're making up or that we're choosing. It has very real consequences, like us not being able to have healthy families and provide for our kids, our children. So I do try to make that point of, this isn't about statistics, and it is. We need those to make the point, but this is about families in Ohio. This is about mothers. This is about children, and thank you for bringing that point, and I'll continue to make it as well.
And I would imagine with women being the head of households more now than ever, it even compounds the problem even more.
That's exactly right.
Thank you so much to our panelists for your efforts on this very, very important topic. Full-time working mom of a 5.5-month-old, 12 weeks of unpaid maternity leave. I was wondering if we could drill down on the issue of unconscious bias that Priyanka was talking about, and in particular, this issue we talked about at the beginning of leadership being associated with the white male. Like, where do we begin to change that as well? Because I think that's part of the culture we're in that leads to these unconscious biases. Thank you.
I think from a tactical perspective, one of the strategies is just highlighting women in leadership roles. So we have, a few years ago, we launched this, it's an email correspondence that goes out, and it's just a story to success. And we highlight women and their stories in leadership roles. And I think having those role models that people can look to, and people can recognize people who look like them or people who have imbalanced families and other responsibilities and still continue, right, with their career responsibilities. I think that's just a very tactical thing that we can do. I think the other thing, just going back, and I'm just really passionate about this topic, as you can tell, the equal parental leave policy, because the point that drives home is that women are not the primary caretakers in all situations. Once you equalize that opportunity for men and women to be the primary caregiver, it just opens up all kinds of opportunities for women to let them network, to let them progress in their careers, and not be the ones who's making the choice to step back.
I would say too, I'm pretty excited to vote for a woman to be president of the United States. And I think that is an example of these topics, like equal pay, like paid leave, like raising the wage, are issues that are so critical to women and ending this discrimination in the workplace. And I think that, having from the presidency on down, having women in government is so critical to really addressing these issues. We've gone backwards in the State House. We hit a high in the early 90s and have gone backwards. Ohio's never had a woman governor or a woman senator. We've obviously never had a woman president, which is why I started by saying how excited I am to be supporting one this summer and fall. But we need women in elected office advocating and making these policy changes so that America and Ohio can lead rather than be behind on so many of these critical measures.
Well, I think doing that also changes the ideal or what leadership looks like, right? If you have more women at high-level positions, well, then all of a sudden it's not as much of a white male. And I think my response to that is, for me, it's the small things that accumulate. If I were running for office, that my platform would be minutia matters, I think. Because really, so I think some of it is training managers to be aware of bias. So a lot of times when there's conversations about who to promote, men are talked about with how their skill set and how competent they are, whereas with women, their performance is attributed either to hard work or to luck. So who are you going to promote? The person that's lucky or the person that's competent? And so this is where it's tiny things, but these decisions happen thousands of times, over and over again. And so eventually that's where we end up with far fewer people at the top, who are women.
You mentioned your boss, I should say the CEO of your company, is strongly advocating. I assume he's a white male.
Yes.
There have to be other white males who are doing great work in this area. Can we at least name a few? Because I feel like there's been some bashing to some degree. And I want to make sure we don't do that here. Good point. Are there some champions, though, that we should know of in a legislature or in business here in the city, in the state, that are champions of this that we should take note of?
I would say U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown is a great champion for women's issues. And, of course, I hate to say that we've never had a woman governor or senator and not, think of the important work he has done in paid leave and certainly raising the wage and worker issues. So there's a great political leader on this issue. Others.
Add in there though that leadership matters at each level.
Yes.
So we're talking at the CEO level, but I look to so many sponsors during my career, right? The people that I've worked with who've just been great sponsors and have accelerated my career path. And quite frankly, I would say 6 out of 10 of them have been white males. So I think everyone, makes a difference.
We may be short on our list here, but maybe the Facebook page will be littered with names.
Well, and I also think looking at, the annual list of best companies for women
Yes.
to work for, that is a clear
Yep.
indication of the companies that are more forward-thinking, have more family-friendly policies.
So I'll tell just a quick story. Back in 2008, I was interviewing for a job, and it came to that point in the interview where they ask you if you have any questions for them, and I made the choice to ask about their maternity leave policy because I was 6 months pregnant at the time, even though you couldn't tell. And the response literally was the person leaned over and said, "Ma'am," at the time, they said, "I noticed you're not wearing a wedding ring. How do you plan to make that work?"
Ooh.
So with that in mind, like with our conversation that we have about mentorship, and I so agree with your comments that like an informal mentorship is such a great way to go. But it takes so long to figure out how to do that. We don't have classes in our schools like teaching you how to negotiate your salary. So like what are the education components that could help girls at all levels to teach them and equip them with these skills that no matter what they come out of college with degree to succeed?
Well, I think part of that is we always focus on women, and it's almost like we have a fix the female problem, and I feel like that's not the case. If you look at Anne-Marie Slaughter's article in the Atlantic Monthly, some of this is about getting men on board too, and so I think that's a big part of it. And I think to your question, again, I'm hesitant to say, well, you should steer women towards higher paying occupations. I feel like people should do what they love. I know in the MBA program at Weatherhead, we do have a lot of classes specifically about women in the workplace, and we also have classes at the Dively Executive Education Center because, it can be very difficult to navigate, and having specific advice, hearing about the research, what works, what doesn't work, I feel like those are things that give women an advantage. And I'm sure there's negotiation workshops that go on,
Earlier it was said that when women are CEOs, the companies are more profitable. Is there a quality that they bring to the table in that position that we should be more aware of as a society?
So you bring up a very interesting point. The nuance is that the study found women in CEO positions, there's necessarily not a strong correlation with higher profitability. It's women in executive management, so that 30% with the 6% improvement in margin was the number of women in executive management. So the lone woman at the top is not the one making the difference. It's that combination of a lot of women interacting together and driving a culture that are resulting in higher profitability.
What is it about that, though? What is it about the feminine energy or women in that role in management? What are they bringing to the table that differentiates from...
There's just less mansplaining, is that the term? No, I think some of it is an openness, and I think women, because of our social roles in society, we are more caretaking, and yet we also have to be cognizant of how people are working together and families. And so I think women bring that skill set and also emotional intelligence. All of this is kind of encouraged in our society, and there are plenty of men that have those attributes also, but I think that might be some of it.
I would also argue that it's great that it highlights women, but I think it's also about diversity in thought, right? High-performing teams are based on different experiences and different skill sets, and it's almost an argument that diversity is making that difference.
Sure.
Right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about gender equity, and I always get very, very excited about it, so thank you for creating the space for us to do that. My question is around the terminology that we use. We often say things like women make 79 cents. Well, women aren't making 79 cents. White women are. And so I was wondering if we can start having a broader scope of how we're defining women and being more thoughtful about saying white women are making 79 cents, African American women are making 65 cents. Because I feel like if we're not having a holistic conversation, then we're leaving people out again. I mean, I feel from a historic perspective, Sojourner Truth all over again. Ain't I a woman?
Yeah.
So I just wonder if, what you think might need to happen in order for us to have a more holistic conversation about the true wage gap for women.
Well,
Great question.
One, I think, is to your point, is just about language. And you're absolutely right. You called the panel on this, and you're correct about that. So I think it's being more specific in the language. And it is harder for African American women in the workplace. Whereas there's bias against women in general, it's even tougher for African American women. And that's a fact.
And I know that I agree with that we need to be as inclusive as possible when talking about this problem, and we need all women, African American women, Latina women, Asian women. We all need to come together to tackle this problem. So we need to make sure that we're talking about the entire problem when we attack it and try to address it. I try to do that, and I will continue to try to do better, because I think you're exactly right.
Hi, what is the redressal mechanism for women who get discriminated? Say, for example, not getting good appraisal if you're pregnant and the organization knows that you're going on leave after some time, so they will not give you a good appraisal. Is there a redressal mechanism for that, or is it used?
I mean, there's a lot of lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits brought by women, women of different races. So that's definitely one. I would hope it's more of a last resort, but again, some of this goes to, well, what company are you working for? Are they more evolved? Some of the things Priyanka talked about. There are some organizations also will periodically do a gender equity study. And that could be broken out by gender and by race within gender. And I think, if organizations can proactively do that every few years, they can be on top of this. And that's only going to increase the trust of employees, that their organization's actually looking out for them, which is going to benefit them probably in terms of higher retention, less turnover, more organizational commitment.
And we do have some federal laws in place that prevent pregnancy discrimination, for example, but they have been whittled down to the point where the protection that they're providing is so limited, and there are so many exclusions. You could drive 100 Mack trucks through it. Smaller employers are often excluded, and smaller can be defined as, I think in some of these laws, less than 200 employees. Right. And there's just so many women who end up not protected by their measures. So, we have, I think, made some attempts to address these problems. I think a lot of people out there think we've done more than we have, and don't realize how much discrimination still exists around pregnancy, for example, and we have a lot of work to do.
I've seen some statistics that suggest that small businesses actually really struggle in this area of gender equity. So I guess that would support what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, defining small. I know, for example, with my equal pay bill, I thought about, trying not to be burdensome, although of course to me every woman deserves equal pay, whether she's at a Fortune 500 company or a small local freestanding shop or something. But we tried to make our exclusion as small as possible, rather than sometimes you'll just see things that are, 200 employees. That's not small. Right. I mean, we got to be real careful about how many women we end up not giving protections to when with these little, flicks of the pen and change in a law can really hurt a lot of people.
Yes, have there been any studies about pay equity with immigrant women who have come to this country from another country and another culture?
I feel like there's research on almost everything, but that's research that I don't know anything about.
I don't know much about that research either.
No, I don't know.
What about perceptions that men have on this issue?
Well, I think it depends on the man, right? I mean, we can't say that all women are alike.
No, I
all
mean,
men
are
alike,
there
but-
studies that say percentage of men believe
Studies.
this is an issue, that kind of thing?
No, and this is actually one of the frightening things, is that when you look at the research on bias, it's not just men. Women hold those same biases, and when you read that, that's a little frightening, because then it feels like, okay, how is this going to change if we are all held accountable, and we have these biases?
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful discussion. And as someone who's been in the workplace for nearly 30 years, it's amazing that this is still a hot topic. However, what I'd like to ask you, has there been any statistics or trends as it relates to generations, the different generations, i.e. millennials and X-Gens, and how they approach this?
We are seeing that the wage gap is much smaller the more junior someone gets. So for women entering the workforce, I think it was ages 22 to 26, there's much less of a gap there. And that's one of the things that is of interest to me is, in another 30 years, what is it going to look like? Because there are still a lot of people in the workforce that started out with a much different compensation, and so that has been exacerbated over the years. So once that population moves out, I'll be curious to see how it changes. But I will say things change very slowly. The research on stereotypes, they did studies in the 70s about this think manager, think male phenomenon. They redid it 20 or 30 years later. It hasn't really changed. And so these things are very impervious to change and require, I think, a focused effort to get them to change.
We often hear about the technology corridor having real issues in diversity, and they're mainly talking about people of color. Still an issue in terms of women pay equity in that industry. I know we talked about STEM, but specifically when we think of some of the Googles and those type of companies, that new industry, if you will.
So there is a lot of disparity, going back to the Peterson study, between industries and the gender gap. And technology was one of the industries where there wasn't as much gender parity. It's interesting too, the distinction between, for example, utilities and healthcare and finance were industries where there was more parity. And then technology and energy and some of the manufacturing industries, it seemed like there was less parity. So there's still a data pointing in that direction.
Hi, I wanted to know, as a mom, I appreciate all of the efforts, both in terms of legislation and leadership, top-down support for women in the work environment. But I have to say that I always feel like women who aren't moms kind of take a backseat in this conversation somehow. And I'm just wondering what your experience is in supporting that part of the community as well.
I think we hear that a lot in management, of priority is given to, and not just women, but men and women that have children, feeling like, well, yes, we have to make some exceptions for them, they have to go home and get their kids. But people that don't have children will often say, well, wait a minute, I have a life too. Isn't that equally valuable? And so to me, I just feel like society has gotten out of control with the number of hours we're expecting everyone to work. So until that is reined in, and honestly, I end my last MBA class pointing to the women and say, okay, I need one of you to start your own company with maximum, 35-hour work weeks with flexibility. Someone has to step up and build the model of what is possible.
Can I work then?
Yes.
So I have a question based on what you just said. So we've seen a huge trend in more women becoming entrepreneurs. Right. And I think it's for exactly the reason you said. However, 95% of venture capital is going to white men. So, at the systems level, is it better to focus on the venture capital and where the money's coming for women to start their own businesses, as opposed to women working their way up in a very biased culture in a bigger system that's already lived this way for 50 years?
You know, I mean, I don't think I can say one way is right or wrong. I think there are certain people that kind of have the personality characteristics to be entrepreneurs and others don't. So I think that's some of it. But I feel like anytime you can design and write your own ticket, you know, you're going to write it to benefit yourself. So, you know, and I think also, I feel like I did hear about a venture capital firm that had recognized that most money was going to white males, and they made a decision that they were only going to focus on female and minority you know, propositions for new companies. So, you know, I think with all of this, awareness is the first step. Once people become aware, then they can be more conscious about choosing how to behave.
Anyone else want to?
I would just say it's different than technology, but you know, my salary, for example, is in the Ohio law. It's an Ohio statute, so I get paid what every other state representative makes. And in some ways, I think that gets back to that secrecy part I was talking about. When it's out in the open, your pay is equal. So in some ways, I think that's an interesting solution to this problem. Although I will say men tend to get the congregate in the leadership spots, which also in the statute are the bonuses that you get for those positions. So even when it's laid right out there and is in the public record, there's some equality, but there's still the problem persists.
Got a lot of work to do, folks. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday Forum panel discussing gender equity in the workplace. Our community partner for today's forum is the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women. Additionally, we welcome guests at a table hosted by the Cleveland Foundation. We thank you for your support. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.